Before I begin, you all may know this, but it was supposed to be Music Ministry Sunday this week, but we needed to pivot because of the snow and the choir not having time to rehearse. And so as we are in this in-between sermon series, I looked to the lectionary, a set of passages assigned to each Sunday, to figure out what I might preach on. And the following scripture is the one that was there for us this week. God has a way of timing things to be more timely than anything us humans could ever schedule to do. So let us hear these words from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who asks of you, and if anyone takes away what is yours, do not ask for it back again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive payment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he himself is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down and shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As it might have been for many of you all, the news of the murder that occurred in South Roanoke this week left me in shock. As more details came out, the truth became harder to comprehend. It's troubling and it's terrifying, and not what anyone wants to have happen in their city, their neighborhood, nor in their apartment building. But it has happened here. And somewhere along the way, something has gone terribly wrong for this to occur. Years of living in poverty turn the vulnerable even more vulnerable. Years without stable housing leads to exacerbated mental health issues. Prison time served, but not in a way that rehabilitates someone to leave prison and live a life transformed. People who are unwell, continuing in life unwell without any meaningful intervention. And yet, there's Susan Williams, who was killed this week. She spent her life caring for the vulnerable and the downtrodden. In her working years, Susan was the CEO of the local Office on Aging. She headed up the Meals on Wheels programs, and even as the CEO would go out and drive some of the routes. Her friend, Amanda Shershid-Lindsay, spoke of her as someone who wanted everyone to feel valued and to feel like they had someone in their corner. In retirement, Susan volunteered at RAM and was an active member of the steering committee working to end homelessness in Roanoke. We want to live in a world with order and not in a world where things like this happen. But random acts of violence do happen. And we have to acknowledge that most people who are in situations of homelessness and chronic law breaking are unwell. Their years of poverty and street living have led to worse mental health, and things like this can happen. It doesn't mean it's true for everyone in those situations, so we cannot cast them out and push them out of our city. And we also can't abandon all caution. There is a terrible tension that lies within this risky love we are called by God to participate in. And there isn't anyone better to help us think about how to engage in risky love other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said in his sermon titled Loving Your Enemies, he outlines the 3 reasons why we should love our enemies. He writes, the first is fairly obvious. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate. Susan's death is a tragedy, not simply because her life is gone, but because the man who took her life was so unwell that this was the only thing he could think to do of. So in addition to reminding us of a few things that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said to this morning, I also want to tell you about a few people who might give us some ideas for our own ways forward. One of those people is Father Gregory Boyle, a Jesuit priest who began pastoring in the 70s and in the 80s in what was the poorest Catholic parish in Los Angeles, which also had the highest concentration of gang activity in the city. He and his parish decided to take up the radical approach to treat gang members as human beings, beginning what would eventually become Homeboy Industries, providing hope, training, and support to former gang-involved and formerly incarcerated folks so that they could redirect their lives and now become contributing members of their community. And through the 30 years of Homeboy ministry so far, Boyle, also known as Father G, has come to see that the demonizing of others is always untruth, and that all people are innately good, no exception. That might be a stretch too far for some of the most Presbyterian in here. After all, John Calvin gave us the phrase total depravity, meaning that we're all fallen and sinful. Yet there is something undoubtedly powerful about Homeboy Industries' goal to cherish people so that they can enjoy the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. In Boyle's latest book, Cherished Belonging, The Healing Power of Love in Divided Times, he writes of people being unwell. It goes beyond diagnosable mental health issues, becoming his way of describing all those who act and make decisions that further divide people from one another. Boyle pinpoints this sickness as what causes people to act in the most inhumane ways. Over 30 years into Homeboy Ministries, and Boyle knows well that you don't commit murder if you are well. You are not charged with committing several crimes within the time span of a year if you are unwell. You don't burn down a Little Caesars if you are well, just as the person who took Susan's life also did a few years ago. Yet even in this deep unwellness, they too are a child of God. And in our worry and in this lack of order, in this nonsensical, violent act that feels filled with hate, we might be tempted to hate. But King's second reason not to return hate with hate is that hate is contagious. He states, hate scars the soul and distorts the personality. Mindful that hate is an evil and dangerous force, we too often think of what it does to the person hated. But there is another side we must never overlook. Hate is just as injurious to the person who hates. Like an unchecked cancer, hate corrodes the personality and eats away its vital unity. Hate destroys a man's sense of values and his objectivity. So where do we go from here? Well, Jesus in the Gospel of Luke encourages us to show one another God's love, to take risks to love. And even when we are suspicious and cautious and treading lightly, we are to still err on the side of risk-taking. For Jesus has never called us to remain on the shore, but to wade into the waters. When I was in seminary, a required class was pastoral care. The idea was students would go and visit the same person over 6 weeks, and you would learn how to visit with someone, how to follow where they lead, how to hopefully ask good questions. I had recently been introduced to a minister in the south side of Richmond who told me, "I have just the woman for you to go and visit." Her name was Mrs. Frances Hill Doris. Frances was blind when I met her, but that did not stop her from being an avid learner through books on tape, nor did it stop her from solving crosswords if she could just get someone to read her the clues. Frances met her husband, Glenn, at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. They had been married for 68 years. Glenn died less than a year before I began getting to know Frances. And as someone about to begin their ministry, Frances told me story after story. There were the silly stories, of course, and the serious ones. After all, this was a white couple whose ministry began in the late 40s and early 50s in Georgia and went on to South Carolina and then to Kentucky. It did not take Frances and Glenn long to realize that the fight for civil rights was going to be an essential part of their ministry. Everywhere they ministered, they worked for racial integration. For Glenn, this looked like helping to start an African American Presbyterian church in South Carolina in 1953. For them and their children, at times it looked like hiding in the house while a cross was burned on the front lawn by the Klan. And when they got to Anderson, South Carolina, their ministry involved Frances being asked to serve as the director of the first Project Head Start, also known as Universal Pre-K. Frances was known as a citizen who placed a high value on education and on civil rights. And the board felt if there was anybody who could oversee a universal pre-K program where the student body and the teachers would be racially integrated, it had to be Frances. So Frances lined up all the teachers. She got students all enrolled, and it was just a day or two from beginning. And then the school was burned down. And while it was a surprise that the school was burned down, it was not a surprise to learn that local members of the Klan had been behind it, including a member of the church Glenn served in. Frances was heartbroken. So much work had gone into getting the program started, and now what would happen? Would people still take the risk and try to open it? Or would they shut the doors on this possibility? And while ashes from the fire still smoldered, Sunday came, as it always has a habit of doing, even when the pastor and their family and the town is reeling from something terribly distressing. And on this Sunday, it was a communion Sunday at Central Presbyterian Church. Frances was slated to serve communion. And as she stood at the front of the church watching the congregation come forward, the very man behind the burning down of the school came forward. Do I pull the elements away for him? Do I give someone else the bread and the wine because I cannot do it? Do I refuse him communion? Her thoughts swirled as he came closer. And then it came to her. Jesus' words, "Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you." So standing with trembling legs and arms, yet standing firmly on her faith, she served this man, this child of God, communion. For God's love is for that child of God too. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s third reason why we should love our enemies, is that love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. We never get rid of an enemy by meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity. By its very nature, hate destroys and it tears down. And by its very nature, love creates and builds up. Love transforms with redemptive power. So what does that look like in Roanoke now? Well, the current president of the local Office on Aging, Ron Boyd, worked with Susan, says, well, she was relentless in her advocacy for underserved communities, and her death has ignited a newfound passion in Boyd's mission to continue her legacy. It's just hard to process right now that she had lived such a rich life in her 80s, and to be tragically lost in this way just lets us know that there's a lot more work to be done. For Boyd, it's not stepping back from the work, it's forging on. It's that redemptive power of love carrying him onward in this work. This redemptive, transforming love God invites us to know within our souls and to reflect back out into the world is risky. And yet, in offering this love, we live all the more into the fullness of our identity as children of God. And this action of love allows us to better know God. There's a lot of places, from our neighborhoods to our city, in our state and in our country, that need this kind of love. So may we find the open doors God places before us, so that even with shaking legs, we can step forward firmly in our faith and choose to love. Amen.